I have an unpopular opinion, and that opinion is Sword and Sorcery is a uniquely American art form, and it was created by Robert E. Howard. I'm going to tell you why right now. The Sword and Sorcery literary genre is rooted firmly in the traditions of Robert E. Howard, an American author from the 1920s and 30s. If you have not heard of him, he is the creator of not only Conan the Barbarian, but Conan's precursor, Kull the Conqueror, as well as a host of other fantasy and horror-based characters like Solomon Kane, Bran McMorn, and El Borak. Howard's creations are famous in the United States, but Howard is much less well known. I'm going to tell you why America's influence directly led to the creation of that specific genre. First, Howard created Sword and Sorcery with the story Kull, the Shadow Kingdom. It was published in Weird Tales magazine in 1929. That story puts Kull on the throne of Atlantis, and the key to this is it involves elements of both magical fantasy as well as a fictional history. Conan is a direct successor to Kull in Howard's literary tradition. He said so directly. So let's break this down. Robert Howard grew up in Texas in the early 20th century. He knew people who had traveled west and fought Comanches on the frontier in the 1850s and 60s. He heard stories about Comanche raids as a child. They made an impression on his psyche that eventually led to the creation of his Sword and Sorcery characters. But what exactly is Sword and Sorcery? We need to define that. Sword and Sorcery, for me, is a storytelling form that involves the frontier, barbarian cultures, versus a civilization that is either decadent or decaying. So, Howard's stories definitely have this. The Kull stories have this, as well as the Conan stories, although their two protagonists are different in their orientation. The historical context of America plays a really important role in Howard's writing. As they emerged in the early 20th century, America was undergoing profound changes. Industrialization, westward expansion, urbanization, and expansion, both internally and externally. This genre was created for adventure journal magazines. It was the short form of entertainment for that day. It allowed Americans to explore their national identity through creative fiction. These stories envisioned a different world. These stories removed Americans from the complexities of modernity. They wanted to escape to a fantastical realm. Howard delivered on this. Now, these American influences on Sword and Sorcery, you can't just ignore them. You can't throw them out. There's the frontier spirit, which is a hallmark of American mythology. The cowboy, the West, the frontiersman, the pioneer. These are all American archetypes. And I know there's arguments about why those might be negative archetypes or negative stereotypes, but you cannot deny that they are important in the context of American history and American storytelling. Now hold on. Before you say, wait a second, Sword and Sorcery was created by the British, what about the King Arthur stories? What about the Greeks in Greek mythology? Those stories are different in their origins, and they have different cultural traditions that underpin them. The frontier is not as important in either of those traditions. The unknown is not as important in either of those traditions, because when Howard was writing, it was a time of dramatic change in American history. These stories emphasize rugged individualism, independence, self-reliance, and all of these characters, Kull and Conan especially, have a quest for freedom. It's embodied by their characters. That's why their stories are so popular still today. Stories like Conan in the movie that was created in the 80s, they still resonate in American culture because they have deeply American values. It's so important to acknowledge the American roots of this specific genre because it gives us insight into the American psyche that not only was present in the 1920s, but is still present with so many Americans here today. Now, I really want to touch on this point. There's something between civilization and the wilderness that is a really important conflict in Howard's stories that is not present in the other mythological traditions that I know folks are going to argue about. No, go ahead. You can argue below in the comments. That's part of the point of this. I like argument. There is direct conflict between civilization and the wilderness, order and chaos, in all of Howard's Sword and Sorcery stories. And that, from my perspective, is a critical factor in defining the genre. There's a lot of great stories out there that are fantasy, but much fewer are Sword and Sorcery because they do not have the wilderness versus civilization conflict within them. The biggest factor that we cannot ignore in asserting that sword and sorcery as a genre is an American art form is the focus on the individual triumphing over their surroundings and circumstances. What could be more American than the main character struggling against the unknown and the frontier and overcoming those odds in story after story after story? It's a defining quality of the United States. Whether you like it or not, that is an American characteristic. So while I hear you saying that Greek and British mythology are certainly entertaining adventure stories, I will always assert that they are not sword and sorcery, because sword and sorcery comes from the American culture and history that directly influences creator Robert E. Howard. Hey, if you've enjoyed this video, if you could consider dropping a like or a subscription, I really appreciate it. My name's Adam Scott for the RPG Club, and I'm hoping that you will join us again next time.